This is Dark Illumination Report Podcast Episode 9. The views expressed on this podcast are the views of the podcast host only. The host neither represents or endorses any specific satanic organization or tradition. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes, and please tell a friend. I'd really appreciate it. You can also follow me on Twitter at RJWO15. If you have questions or comments, you can leave us a message at speakpipe.com/DIR podcast. That's speakpipe.com/DIR podcast.
This is the Dark Illumination Report podcast with RJ Womack.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for this episode of the podcast. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about religious text. When I talk about religious text, I usually categorize them in one of three ways. I categorize them either as inspired text, channeled text, or direct communications. Channeled text are those texts that, while the author does not claim they are channeled, they feel that they have been guided or directed by a demon or Satan in some way in the process of writing the text or the story. An example of this kind of text would be the Diabolicon by Michael Aquino. According to Aquino's account, the Diabolicon was written in 1970 while he was on deployment to Vietnam. He was in combat when he was writing this. And in fact, part of the manuscript was destroyed as part of that combat when it got blown up by artillery or something like that. But anyway, the point is, Aquino never says that it's a direct channeling. He never claims that it's a channeling. He says that as he was writing it, it began to take on a life of its own, and words just seemed to come to him. And when he wanted to delete certain sections of the book, he found that he didn't feel like it was right to do that. Initially, when he started to write the text, it was meant to be his own version of John Milton's Paradise Lost. It wasn't intended to be a religious text per se. It wasn't intended to be anything sacred. But as he said, it took on a life of its own and words seemed to come to him. And he just kind of felt guided while he was doing it. An example of a channeled text would be the Al-Jawa by Sheikh Adig. According to the legends surrounding the Al-Jawa, the book was received as a result of a channeling, and the message was then copied down by an assistant. I feel it's worth mentioning here that one of the biggest problems with channeling is the fact that out of all the particular methods you could use, it's probably the one that is most subject to fraud and most subject to misinterpretation. And I say that because, first of all, you have to assume that the person who's doing the channeling or receiving the message is trustworthy. Let's assume, for the sake of this discussion, that the person that's doing the channeling is a genuine person and is receiving some sort of genuine message. The second problem is that there's almost no way to really tell what spirit you're talking to. When you do channeling, it's almost impossible to verify the identity of the spirit. It's difficult. So even though the spirit might say it's Satan or say it's a particular demon, you have no way to verify that. So what you want to try to do is try to test the spirit. And even if you manage to test the spirit, there's still no guarantee that you'll not be deceived. And one of the things you'll find when dealing with cult leaders in particular is they don't want you to challenge them. They don't want you to question them. So what they'll do is say, "How dare you be disrespectful? How dare you question me? How dare you question my authenticity?" If you have somebody who's channeling that has that attitude, then you can almost guarantee that it's a cult leader. Because Satan, the Lord of Darkness, Hasatan, would most certainly know that there are tons of people who try to pretend to be him. And if he has a genuine message for you, then he would want you to test him. He would want you to know that it's him. And he would want you to be sure. You see, I don't believe that any spirit would have a problem with you trying to verify that it's them. You trying to make sure that it's not somebody trying to deceive you. Because I think the Lord Satan would expect you to question people, pretending to be him, or any other demon would expect the same from you. If you have somebody channeling a spirit who doesn't want to be tested, it's either because it's a deceiving, lying spirit who's trying to convince you that it's somebody that it's not, or it's a person pretending to channel spirits who really isn't, who doesn't want you to figure out that you're being deceived. Other than that, I can't think of any logical reason why you wouldn't test a spirit before you take their advice. The third problem with the idea of channeling is that even if you've tested the spirit, and even if you trust the person doing the channeling, the spirit is still coming through a human vessel. When you're using a human being to transmit the message, there's always going to be a possibility for error. The Greeks were well aware of this, even with their oracles. When they received a message, they never took it literally. They always interpreted it, even though they believed in the oracles and considered them sacred. And lastly, an example of a directly communicated text would be the Book of the Law by Aleister Crowley, which was received in April of 1904 over a 3-day period. According to Crowley's account, the spirit Aiwass manifested himself in the room with Crowley and spoke the words of the Book of the Law to him, which Crowley later identified as Satan, Lucifer, the devil. Now, whether you believe Crowley and whether you believe his story, that's all up to you to decide. But I'm just telling you what Crowley himself said. Crowley said that Aiwass appeared in the room with him and spoke in an audible way, not telepathically, the words of the Book of the Law. That was Crowley's own statement about what happened. When it comes to religious texts, just like everything else in Satanism, it's all a matter of opinion. Regardless of what text you believe are sacred, there's always going to be those people who disagree with you and who are going to try to tear down the text that you believe in and try to say that it's not credible or it's not believable or it's not real or whatever. So you have to choose what you believe in and choose the texts that matter to you and not worry about anybody else. If the text makes your life better, if it helps you to develop yourself, that's what matters, regardless of what anyone else might say. Just remember that, and don't ever forget it.
Thank you for listening to the Dark Illumination Report podcast. For the latest news headlines, show information, and more, go to rjwomack.com. That's rjwomack.com.